Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC live lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we would be talking on William Wordsworth. We would be discussing William Wordsworth as a critic. And for this discussion we have once again with us in our studios Professor Bhim Singh Dhaya. Professor Bhim Singh Dhaya is a renowned professor of English who has contributed a lot in the area of academics. He has students both in India and abroad, and he is appreciated through his books. He has authored numerous books. If you get time, please do read them. So friends, we would like to tell you all that if you want to ask questions from Professor Dhaya on today's topic, then do contact us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800110430. I repeat, our number is 1800110430. So friends, let's welcome our guest Professor Bhim Singh Dhaya, and let's try to understand today's topic in detail, that is William Wordsworth as a critic. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you. Well, this morning we shall discuss Wordsworth as literary critic because he comes after Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson represented 18th century, and in the larger tradition he represented the new classical mode of thinking, mode of writing, and credo of criticism. As William Blake had said right in the 18th century, later part, action and reaction are equal and opposite. So new classical was the action of the 18th century, and what Wordsworth then took up was the reaction to that. And it was, as Blake had said, opposite to what the 18th century practiced. Wordsworth wrote the title of the poems being Lyrical Ballads, which was published in 1798, end of the 18th century more or less. Now these lyrical ballads are in complete opposition to the kind of poetry that had been written in the 18th century. 18th century, if you remember, Alexander Pope was the greatest poet. Even Dr. Johnson, better known as Critic, was a poet too. Vanity of Human Wishes. So the kind of poetry they wrote was ideas versified. They had their opinions on everything. It may be administration, it may be education, it may be family life, it may be human relations, whatever. All that they versified. And there were set rules, standard meters, standard rhyme scheme, standard stanza form, generally rhymed couplet. So everything was predetermined, and they were great admirers of the ancient classics. Right from Aristotle's Poetics to Horace's Ars Poetica. These were the two great names in classical criticism. First Aristotle, then during the Roman period, Horace. Aristotle was in the 3rd century BC, as early as that, and Horace comes in the early years of the AD, which was called Roman period. In between, of course, medieval times, you have Longinus. Then later you have Renaissance, represented by Philip Sidney. And then beginning of the new classical period, you have John Dryden, which we have already covered. He wrote essay on dramatic poesy, which we did in the earlier lectures. So, in reaction to Dryden and Pope also we did. He also wrote essay of criticism. But then Wordsworth reacted to all this. The basic difference is that whereas Dryden and Pope and Johnson also belong to a particular class of society, the higher strata, privileged to have the highest education and to know the history, the philosophy, all knowledge was available to them. Now Wordsworth represents just the opposite. Wordsworth represents the rural stock, rural sentiments, elementary feelings, and the human nature as it is originally, without any influence of society or civilization. So, in sum, whereas Dryden, Pope, Johnson, they represented the civilized world, so called, Wordsworth decided to represent the uncivilized one, the natural world, and the common people who may not have education, but who are pure at heart, simple in mind, and talk straight. So, lyrical ballads, the very term ballad is a popular song which people sing. Communities, every community has its own stock of songs which are sung at different occasions, at different social events, ceremonies, rituals, festivals. So Wordsworth went back to this life, that the real life is this one. The so-called civilized life is limited to a few, a thin strata of society as a whole. The highly educated, the highly sophisticated, highly rich also, privileged. It is these people, and who take pride in speaking language which will not be understood by the common people. So it is a sort of code language. So Wordsworth reacted against all this, and he thought and he propagated, he insisted that poetry is the true voice of feeling. It's not commentary on life, just as Dryden, Pope and Johnson had made it. Commentary of the sophisticated elite who would look down upon a common way of life. So Wordsworth wrote the Lyrical Ballads, which he published in 1798. That book also included some, very few, 4 I think, ballads by S.T. Coleridge. So that's why Wordsworth and Coleridge are named together. So they were launching a new movement against the neoclassical credo and for the new form of poetry which came to be called the Romantic. Romantic means free expression to your feelings and thoughts. Now literature does not come out of nothing. It is not written out of nowhere. There have to be circumstances. there have to be situations, there have to be social events and political also, which lead to the production of a particular kind of verse, particular kind of poetry. Here the relevant events that had taken place in the 18th century were two. First was the American War of Independence, which started in 1773, ended in 1776. That brought about the first democracy in the world. So obviously, poetry of the new world, of the democratic world, had to be different. That's why Walt Whitman wrote the Song of America, Song of the Common Man. So he wrote profusely. Song of Myself, his famous poem, one of the earliest ones. On the same pattern, you find Wordsworth writing a sort of song of myself. He wrote these ballads, which are popular songs of common people. Later, he wrote a long poem called the Prelude, which is an autobiography in verse, which is about tracing the growth of his own personality, showing how nature plays its part in shaping one's personality. At least in his case it did. So that's why he said goodbye to the city. It may be Cambridge, it may be London, maybe Oxford, and retired into nature, hills, forests, lakes. That's why that country itself is called the Lake District. So he came to belong to the Lake District. Later he was joined by S.T. Coleridge and also by Wordsworth's sister Dorothy. And they lived like the hermits live in our own country, like saints. Retired life, forest life, denying deliberately, consciously, the benefits of civilized life, city life. That is what he did. So the ballads he wrote, later the friends advised him to write a document explaining why he wrote different kind of poetry. Poetry, these ballads were published in 1798. As I said, S.T. Coleridge had also contributed 4. One of them you must have heard of, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. It's a wonderful poem, long poem. The rhyme means song of the Ancient Mariner. So Ancient Mariner himself speaks about his life, the kind of adventures he had on sea, and then the kind of life there was back home with his wife waiting and so on. But he fell in love with the outer life so much, life of adventure, that he couldn't stay home. He invited everybody to join him on the venture. So this is the background. And as I said, in the background there were 2 important historical events. You we call them political also. One was the American War of Independence, which concluded in 1776 and established the first democracy in the world, where common people had the say in electing their rulers. This had never happened before. Common people were ruled by the privileged ones, the royal families, kings, princes, lords, so on and so forth. Common people were just menials, labor. So this was a historical change that came about in the civilized world in 1776. A still more revolutionary event happened in France. The French Revolution, which was also an upsurge of the people, rise of the power of people, and they executed the rulers, hanged them, killed them, and established democracy. Now these two democracies became the model for the rest of the world, and they transformed literature also. The poets, dramatists, even novelists, they are no longer singing in praise of the high-ups, the royal families, the privileged ones. Now they are writing about the common people. And Wordsworth was a pioneer in that. Let us see what he has to say. I'll read out some of the important statements from his Preface to Lyrical Ballads, which I said was published in 1800, whereas Lyrical Ballads had been published 2 years ago in 1798. One of the famous statements often quoted he makes is, "They who have been accustomed to the gaudiness and inane phraseology of many modern writers, if they persist in reading this book to its conclusion, will no doubt frequently have to struggle with the feelings of strangeness and awkwardness. They will look round for poetry and will be induced to inquire by what species of courtesy these attempts can be permitted to assume that title." So, breaking the ice, paving the new path for a new kind of poetry. But then to do that, it was necessary first of all to attack what was established. He says the kind of poetry neoclassical poets like Dryden, Pope and Johnson have been writing, it is marked by two things, he says. One is the gaudiness and inane phraseology. Gaudiness and inane phraseology. Gaudiness is decoration, ornamental. So, ordinary things of urban life, city life, high life, it is presented as if glamour is all in life. The Rape of Lock, for example, Pope wrote about that high life, although it is satirical, but then it depicts the same life, it doesn't move out of that. It doesn't move into the territories surrounding, reaching the very forest life. Wordsworth does that. So, to make way for new kind of poetry, he had first to attack the established one, the neoclassical poetry. And the two weaknesses that he finds in neoclassical poetry are: one, inane phraseology, means the poetic diction, the kind of language they use is inane, means lifeless. Lifeless because the words do not emanate from the real life of the people. They have been coined by these city-bred poets who must make things different from ordinary life. So, in their attempt to make it different, they make it lifeless because it does not relate to anybody's life. It is only inane. Second weakness he points out is that it is ornamental, merely ornamental. It is lifeless and it is decorative, which means there is nothing substantial in it, no solid ground to stand upon. It is something flimsy, something airy. So, first he attacks the rival, only then he can proceed further. Blake was not wrong. Action and reaction are equal and opposite. So, Wordsworth is reacting to the neoclassical poetry and as vehemently, as strongly as neoclassical poetry was established. He goes on and then he makes another important statement. The principal object then, that was negative, that was attack on the opposition. Now the positive, what has he done in his poems? And he says, the principal object, the main object proposed in these poems was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them throughout as far as possible in a selection of language really used by men, and at the same time to throw over them a certain coloring of imagination, whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect. Long sentence. And I have not completed, I have reached just the half of the sentence. So, the kind of neatness, the kind of brilliance you find in the 18th century prose is missing here, but deliberately. He wants to relate language to life, and life is not as neat and ornamental as neoclassical poetry was. Life is jumbled, life is inarticulated, particularly life of the common people. You go to the village, any village, meet the farmers, meet the laborers. They are not very articulate in what they speak. They are not very refined in their manners. They are just the opposite. It is that kind of situation. Wordsworth has deliberately chosen the inarticulate, innocent, illiterate people of the rural England, and to write poetry about them, how they would speak and describe and illustrate their sentiments, their ideas. Although it is he doing it, but he is aware that what the common people speak cannot pass for poetry. After all, poetry has rhythm, poetry has rhyme, poetry has alliteration. All that has to be included. So he modifies the statement. He says, this common people's language will be improved a little by the play of imagination, coloring of imagination, he says. And language also a selection. He doesn't say verbatim reproduction of what common people speak. It will be a selection of language from the speech that they speak. So, two things. First, it is not verbatim reproduced, there is a selection. Second, even on the selected words, there will be a coloring of imagination, some polishing, so that they sound poetic. And you must have heard songs from the rural India or countryside. They have rhythm, they have rhyme, they have music, they have alliteration, but at the same time the vocabulary they use is not that of the educated Indian, not very refined, but at the same time there has to be some difference between the actual language spoken and the language adopted in a poem. Some refinement will have to be done. If nothing else, in the interest of alliteration, in the interest of music or poetry. And some vulgarity will have to be left out, because common language, there is element of vulgarity also, you can't deny that. So you can't reproduce vulgarity in poetry, because your mission is noble. You want to ennoble the feelings, emotions of people. Well, we will stop for the time being and resume later. Thank you. Well, to resume our discussion of Wordsworth as critic, as I said in the very beginning, he was more of a poet than a critic. And his friend Coleridge, he was more of a critic and less of a poet. But the two together, they make a perfect combination of the poet and the critic. both sharing each other's interests. Coleridge shares Wordsworth's interest in poetry, and Wordsworth shares Coleridge's interest in criticism. So here we are discussing Wordsworth as a critic. So formally, he is not a great critic like Dr. Johnson was, like Coleridge was, or even Dryden was. They were regular critics. He is a poet critic. So there has to be a difference. Poet critic generally ends up by justifying the kind of poetry he has written, whereas a critic will take into account all kinds of poetry, not just one kind. In other words, what the poet critic writes as criticism ultimately becomes a justification for his own kind of poetry. And this is what Preface to the Lyrical Ballads of Wordsworth is. It is a justification for the kind of poetry he has written in the volume called Lyrical Ballads. Let us see what he says further. Further he says, humble and rustic life was generally chosen because in that condition the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, are less under restraint, and speak a plainer and more emphatic language. It's a long statement. Because in that condition of life, our elementary feelings coexist in a state of greater simplicity, and consequently may be more accurately contemplated and more forcibly communicated. Because the manners of rural life germinate from those elementary feelings and from the necessary character of rural occupations, are more easily comprehended and are more durable. And lastly, because in that condition the passions of men are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. A very long sentence. Wordsworth is trying to justify why he chose the life of the common people as the subject of his poetry. And then, why did he choose the kind of language they use? Mainly two things. One, the subject of his poetry, the other, the medium of his poetry, the language. And in both, he justifies in grand elocution. I say grand because the simplest things of life, he says, are the most permanent things of life and most common things of life and most universal. So he is bringing out justification through various ways why he chose common people, their way of life, their language, their way of thinking. So it is comprehensive. It is not merely the language he uses has been picked up from the idiom of the common people. Not just that. The very subject, which is the way of life they lead. and the very thoughts, ideas, feelings, all have been taken from that very stock, that very strata of society. And his final justification for doing that is that they are the people whose feelings are simple, they are the people whose language is, whose speech is straight, and they are the people whose feelings, sentiments, thinking are universal. So, reversing all that the new classical poets and critics were doing, because they were city bound, they were city bred, and they glorified the city life and looked down upon the non-city, the rural, the common people. Because they thought common people were illiterate, cannot appreciate niceties of language or sentiments or ideas. So they wrote what in Urdu later came to be known, the court poetry. It's for the courtiers, because the courtiers alone were sophisticated, who could appreciate the sophisticated idiom. Common people wouldn't know. So the mushairas were organized by these very people and for themselves. You know how democracy was defined. Government by the people, of the people, for the people. Here it is the opposite. New classical poetry is not for the people, not about them, nor for them. But Wordsworth, being a truly democratic poet, a poet of the people, a poet of the common man, is insisting upon his subject being the common life itself, his idiom being the common language actually spoken by the people, and his ideas and sentiments being the same as come out in the life of these very people. So obviously it was a revolutionary thing that Wordsworth was doing. Just as the American Revolution was revolutionary and the French Revolution was revolutionary. Similarly, as they were revolutionary in politics, Wordsworth's movement is no less revolutionary in poetry. In literature, he also creates history, and thereafter no more court poetry was written. The elite poetry was written. Of course, action reaction goes on. Modifications come about, like the Victorians themselves modified what Wordsworth had done. They struck what is famously called compromise, Victorian compromise between the classical and the romantic. But those who launch revolutionary movements, they cannot make compromises. Wordsworth in that sense was a revolutionary, a literary revolutionary who brought about a revolution in literature, in poetry, and produced new kind of poetry, just as American War of Independence and the French Revolution had produced new forms of government. So here you have new form of poetry. Very great thing and very great step. Accordingly, such a language arising out of repeated experience and regular feelings is a more permanent and a far more philosophical language than that which is frequently substituted for it by poets. He is justifying the use of language used by the common people. He says, I do it because of two reasons. Three, in fact. One, that it is a language which can be understood by everybody, common people also. Whereas the neoclassical idiom was and could not be understood by common people, common reader. Secondly, this language carries sentiments and emotions, feelings, ideas, which are the stock ideas, emotions and sentiments of the common people. And then finally he justifies why he chose to do that. He says, I chose to do that because it is in the feelings and sentiments, ideas and emotions of these people where the permanence, the universality lies. The court manners keep changing. They are like fashions. Fashions keep changing. So if you make language also fashionable to a particular set of people, to a particular kind of life, obviously it's not something permanent. It's not going to last forever. It will be replaced by another fashion that will follow, because that is in the nature of fashion. The fashions are never permanent. They come and go. But Wordsworth is after things which are permanent. The way of life which is essential to mankind, and the language which will always remain true, so on and so forth. Further, he goes on and speaks of the purpose, that each poem has a worthy purpose. Not that I always begin to write with a distinct purpose formally conceived, but habits of meditation have, I trust, so prompted and regulated my feelings that my descriptions of such objects as strongly excite those feelings will be found to carry along with them a purpose. In the neoclassical tradition, first came the idea, first came the purpose, and then you versified it. Here it is the other way round. Here it describes life but from life some ideas would emanate. After all, life is molded, modeled, shaped by habits, and those habits carry at the back some ideas, but then you have to catch them. You have to find them yourself. They are not overt. There is a difference between overt ideas and implied ideas. Overt are like somebody is lecturing, like somebody is trying to impress you or influence you with his own ideas. Do this, do not do that. So he is very emphatic. The language will also be emphatic. Wordsworth says, no, I didn't have any such purpose when I wrote my poems. The only purpose was to depict the life of the common people, to portray their sentiments and ideas. Of course, the kind of life they lead, the kind of things they do cannot be totally mindless. After all, it has been shaped by ages, by centuries, by traditions, by customs, by ceremonies, and they can't be useless, they can't be meaningless. So their purpose is always there, but it has to be extracted. It is not overtly there. It is not in the form of imposition, do this, do not do that. So that is the difference. In the poetry of Pope or Johnson, you will find do this, do not do that, or this is good and that is evil. Wordsworth says, I am not doing that. I am just describing life of certain people. For example, there is a poem about a beggar. There is a poem about a farmer. There is a poem about a factory worker. So all sorts of jobs that common people do, they become the subject of poetry, which never was before, because they were considered uncouth, uncivilized, unpoetic. Poetic was only what was refined, artificial, superficial, surface, glamour, shining surface. Wordsworth rejected all that. And he says, I went back to the real life of the people. It may sound unpoetic to Pope, but he says, there is deep down a poetry in this also. You have to tune yourself to feel it. It's a question of feeling. It's not a question of mental appreciation. So whereas new classical poetry appealed to the mind, that too superficial, this poetry of Wordsworth, romantic poetry, this appeals to the heart, not to the mind. Feeling. Even the purpose, as he calls it, or ideas as they are communicated through experience. You have to feel them, you have to live them. You don't have to read them or understand them as a text. So that is the difference. But he says they are not purposeless. Purpose is there. Purpose you have to feel, you have to dig out. And he sums it up, this argument, he says, For all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. This is a famous statement. He is defining what poetry is. So poetry, he says, cannot be made like you make an ornament. Poetry cannot be manufactured as you do in the industry. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Whatever you feel strongly, you start singing about it. Of course, song can be sad as well as happy. Like there are marriage songs, there are love songs. At the same time, songs can be tragic, written when the lovers separate, written when somebody dies. So both tragic and comic songs are there. But then, as Wordsworth says, both emanate from life experience. They are not cooked up, they are not made up, they are not manufactured. They flow from the heart of man. They flow from the experience of life as one goes through. Happy experience or unhappy experience, comic or tragic, both. But the final test is the experience itself. That you have felt it, you have gone through it, and the language speaks it. So you see, the language is chosen in relation to what happens, not in relation to any refinement cooked up by the poets themselves. Goes on, and then he says, my purpose was to imitate as far as is possible, to adopt the very language of men, and assuredly such personifications do not make any natural or regular part of that language. Because in neoclassical poetry you find personifications. Everything is symbolized, everything is metaphorized, nothing is simple and straight, nothing is direct. So he is rejecting all that and reversing it. All indirections removed, all subtleties removed. It is direct poetry. Solid, substantial poetry about things which are actually done by people, felt and thought, and not cooked up by any intelligence. There will also be found, he says in these volumes, little of what is usually called poetic diction. Yes, Pope and Dryden or Johnson, they would not write poetry in ordinary language. The language which is actually spoken by people, the real people in the street, in the factory, in the office, no. It's a highly sophisticated language, refined by the poet. So ordinary words are substituted by extraordinary words, which are manufactured by the poet. They are pleasing, they are ornamental, but then they are not real. They do not communicate any real life lived by people. So he says, my attempt is to write poetry about real people in the real language and for the real enjoyment of those very people. So, he is relating everything to common people, and he says, I am doing that because the life that they lead, elementary life, is permanent. Fashions come and go, and then the urbanization, sophistication varies from place to place. If you go to Moscow, one kind of sophistication. Go to New York, very different kind of sophistication, just the opposite. You go to Rome, still very different. Or go to Middle East, you will find everything reversed. So, these are things which change from place to place, people to people. But he says, I am writing about things which do not change, which are permanent, which are universal. Hence the difference. I think it's time now. We will continue Wordsworth in another discussion. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us your precious inputs on William Wordsworth as a critic. And dear friends, as Professor Bhim Singh Laya himself said, that we would be continuing further. Yes, of course, we would be meeting again tomorrow and would be discussing more on William Wordsworth as a critic. Till then, dear friends, you can give your feedbacks for the particular lecture. And if you have any queries, then do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. We will try to give answers to your questions. So friends, keep watching us, keep writing us. We will be meeting again tomorrow. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.